The name appears only once in surviving official records of Salem Village, Massachusetts, written in ink that has faded to a rusted brown over more than 3 centuries. Tituba, no family name, no recorded place of origin, just a single word marking the testimony of a woman who confessed to witchcraft in February of 1692 and then vanished from every subsequent document, as if she had never existed at all. But this is what the sanitized versions of history never tell you. Tituba's confession did more than ignite the Salem Witch Trials. It contained details so precise and so deeply unsettling that the magistrates ordered entire sections removed from the public record. For more than 200 years, historians claimed those pages had been lost to time. They were not lost. They were deliberately hidden. And what they reveal about the true nature of Salem's hysteria, about who shaped and why, is a story powerful families spent generations making sure would never see the light of day. Before we continue with the story of Tituba and conspiracy that erased her, if you enjoy uncovering the darkest secrets of American history, make sure to subscribe and click the bell icon so you never miss a story that challenges everything you think you know. What happened in Salem in 1692 was not an accident. It was a violent release of tensions that had been building for more than a decade inside a community already cracking under the weight of its own contradictions. Salem Village in late 1691 was not a place of peace. To outsiders, it appeared orderly. Neat clapboard houses clustered around a common, smoke curling from chimneys into gray Massachusetts sky, fields bordered by stone walls that testified to generations of brutal labor. But beneath that appearance, the settlement was splitting apart. Only 15 years old as an independent parish, Salem Village existed in the shadow of its wealthier neighbor, Salem Town, where merchant ships brought fortunes the inland farmers could only imagine. The village was home to perhaps 600 people scattered across farmland that grew rockier and less productive with each passing year. Families who had arrived with optimism found themselves battling thin soil, unforgiving winters, and the constant fear of attacks in the north, where King William's war still raged against French and indigenous forces. That war had devastated the Massachusetts frontier. Since 1688, coordinated raids by French troops and their Wabanaki allies had wiped out settlements across Maine and New Hampshire. Survivors fled south, bringing with them stories of burned homes, families taken captive, and midnight massacres. Several households in Salem Village took in these refugees and heard their accounts firsthand, feeding a growing sense of dread. The enemy, people believed, could be anywhere and could strike at any moment. This fear of unseen threats would become essential to what followed. Yet it was the internal conflicts that truly poisoned Salem Village. Farmers in the western part of the settlement, led by families such as the Putnams, among the earliest settlers, deeply resented the eastern landowners who maintained close ties to the merchant elite of Salem Town. This resentment went far beyond simple economic envy. It reflected a fundamental disagreement over what the community was supposed to be. Were they independent farmers building a godly commonwealth apart from corrupt commerce? Or were they merely a rural extension of Salem Town's mercantile interests? That question infected every part of village life. These divisions were most visible in the village church, where the position of minister had become a battleground. In just 15 years, the congregation had gone through 3 ministers, each departure marked by bitter disputes over pay, housing, and authority. The arrival of Reverend Samuel Parris in 1689 was meant to restore stability to the fractured parish. Instead, he would oversee its collapse. Parris was 46 years old when he came to Salem Village, a man shaped by disappointment and lingering bitterness. Born in London to a family with mercantile connections, he had been sent to Harvard but never completed his degree. He later tried to make his living in Barbados, where his father had left him a small plantation, but he proved incapable of managing either the business or the enslaved people who labored there. By the mid-1680s, he was financially ruined and forced to sell off most of what he owned. What remained were 2 enslaved individuals, a man named John Indian and a woman named Tituba. Even before their arrival in Massachusetts, The relationship between Paris and Tituba was the subject of quiet speculation. Some whispered that she had been his concubine in Barbados, and that his marriage to Elizabeth Eldridge in 1681 was an effort to secure social respectability. There was no concrete evidence to support these claims, yet the rumors endured, fueled by the fact that Paris entrusted Tituba with responsibilities far beyond what was typical for an enslaved woman. She managed much of his household, had access to his personal papers, and was present during private family conversations. This unusual closeness would later take on a darker significance. Paris's turn toward the ministry was less a spiritual calling than a final option. The Puritan churches of Massachusetts were perpetually short of educated ministers willing to serve rural parishes, and Paris's incomplete Harvard education was enough to qualify him. He preached his first sermons in Salem Village in 1688, and after months of tense negotiations over salary and property rights, he was formally ordained in November of 1689. He arrived with his wife Elizabeth, their 3 children, Thomas, Elizabeth, known as Betty and Susanna, his orphan niece Abigail Williams, and his 2 enslaved servants. From the very beginning, Paris's ministry was marked by conflict. His sermons fixated on invisible enemies and secret plots against the godly, growing increasingly grim as winter closed in. He perceived danger everywhere, in congregation members who challenged his pay, in farmers who resisted his authority, even in the land itself, which he described as hostile to righteous settlement. Paris's worldview was deeply paranoid, dividing humanity into the saved and the damned, with the latter vastly outnumbering the former. He warned his listeners that Satan had established a kingdom in the wilderness around them, that demons walked among the people disguised as neighbors and friends. For some villagers, this message resonated powerfully. For others, it was deeply unsettling. The Putnam family, led by Thomas Putnam and his brothers, became Paris's most devoted supporters. They viewed him as an ally against the Salem town faction and as a voice for their vision of a pure, independent farming community. The Porter family and their allies, who maintained strong commercial ties to Salem town, saw Paris as a dangerous and divisive figure, a man whose presence threatened to tear the village apart. They withheld portions of his salary and openly challenged his right to own the parsonage and the land attached to it. By the end of 1691, the village was effectively divided into 2 opposing camps, and Paris's position was becoming more unstable by the week. It was within this poisonous atmosphere that Tituba retreated each night, climbing the narrow stairs to the unheated attic room she shared with John. She was likely around 30 years old, though no one had ever bothered to ask. Her skin marked her as an outsider in a community that prided itself on English purity. Yet whether she was African, indigenous, or mixed ancestry was a matter of hushed debate among the villagers. Some insisted she was a Carib woman from the islands. Others claimed she was African, brought north by way of Barbados. Still others whispered that she carried Spanish or Portuguese blood. The truth was that no one truly knew, and no one cared enough to ask her directly. She was simply referred to as the Indian woman or the minister's slave. Her identity was reduced entirely to her status. Tituba spoke rarely and always with a strange accent that some thought sounded Spanish, others Portuguese, and still others like a broken form of English shaped by the Caribbean. What was known was that she had learned the language in Barbados, before Paris purchased her and carried her into the frozen north. The transition must have been brutal. She was taken from tropical heat to New England winters, from a plantation with dozens of other enslaved people to near isolation in a suspicious and often hostile village, from a place where a knowledge of herbs and healing had been valued to one where such knowledge inspired fear. She worked from before dawn until long after nightfall, cooking, cleaning, tending the garden, caring for Betty and Abigail, spinning, weaving, making soap and candles, performing all the endless labor that kept the colonial household alive. Paris paid her nothing. Of course, she was property, not a person. Yet he depended on her utterly. His wife Elizabeth was frequently ill, suffering from ailments that were never clearly identified, but that left her confined to bed for days at a time. Without Tituba, the household would have fallen apart. In the kitchen, where Tituba spent most of her waking hours. There was a particular stone in the hearth that had cracked from years of heating and cooling. She would sometimes stare at that fracture when she believed no one was watching. The pattern resembled a bird in flight, wings spread wide. Those who noticed assumed she was slow-witted, prone to idle daydreaming. They had no idea she was remembering. Remembering what exactly, the historical record does not say. Perhaps a life before enslavement, before the Middle Passage, before the plantation and the sale that brought her into Paris's possession. Perhaps memories of family, language, and home, all stripped away one by one. Or perhaps she was not remembering at all, but planning, calculating, waiting for an opportunity she believed would eventually come. Because Tituba, as events would soon reveal, was anything but simple-minded. The other person who spent a great deal of time inside the Paris household was Abigail Williams, the minister's niece. She was 11 years old during the winter of 1691 to 1692, orphaned under circumstances that were never fully explained. Some claimed her parents had been killed in an indigenous raid in Maine. Others said they had died of disease. Paris took her in out of obligation, but he treated her less like a daughter and more like unpaid help. Abigail slept in a small room off the kitchen, assisted Tituba with household labor, and received little education beyond basic reading and religious instruction. She was a sharp and observant child with a keen ability to read people. She understood the tensions inside the house, her uncle's bitterness over his treatment by the congregation, her aunt's constant illness, the whispered arguments over money. She also understood how precarious her own position was. If Paris's ministry collapsed, if the family were forced to leave Salem Village, what would become of her? An orphan girl with no property and no prospects had few options in colonial Massachusetts. She would likely be bound out as a servant to whatever household would take her. This fear made Abigail acutely aware of power. She watched how her uncle exercised authority through his sermons, how certain families commanded respect while others were dismissed. She noticed that accusations carried weight, that reputations could be ruined by whispers alone. She was absorbing lessons that would soon prove disastrous. Betty Paris, by contrast, was a fragile and anxious child. At 9 years old, she was prone to nightmares and sudden fits of tears. Her father's sermons terrified her. He preached of children born in sin, of the devil hunting young souls, of the torments awaiting the damned. Betty took these warnings literally, lying awake at night, convinced that demons lurked in the shadows of her room. Her mother's illness frightened her as well. She had already lost one infant sibling, and the fear that her mother might die never left her. The relationship between Betty and Abigail was complicated. They were close in age and spent nearly all their time together, but they were not equals. Betty was a minister's daughter, entitled to privileges and protection. Abigail was a dependent orphan, always conscious of her lower status. This imbalance would become critical as events began to unfold. The winter of 1691 to 1692 arrived early and lingered far too long. By January, snow lay 3 feet deep in places, and firewood supplies in many homes dwindled to dangerous levels. The Paris household suffered alongside the rest of the village. The minister's salary was constantly in arrears, paid in part with firewood that never seemed sufficient. Betty spent long hours shivering near a weak hearth, while her father wrote sermons about godly suffering. Abigail tried to entertain them both with games and stories, but the long, dark days pressed them relentlessly. The isolation was severe. In summer, children played outdoors, women visited neighbors, and men worked in the fields. Winter forced everyone indoors, sometimes for days at a time, when storms made travel impossible. The Paris household was especially isolated because of the minister's ongoing disputes with much of the congregation. Families who might otherwise have invited the children to visit stayed away. The girls had few friends, little diversion, and endless empty hours to fill. It was Abigail who first asked Tituba to tell them stories. The enslaved woman resisted at first. Her role was to work quietly, to remain invisible despite her obvious difference. But Abigail persisted, and eventually, on a January evening when Reverend Paris was visiting a parishioner and Mrs. Paris lay ill in bed, Tituba sat with the two girls beside the dying fire and began to speak. She told them about Barbados, about a heat so relentless it made even the warmest New England summer seem cool by comparison. She described plants that bloomed in colors unknown to gray Massachusetts, birds that could imitate human voices so perfectly that one could not tell them apart from people. She spoke of sugar plantations where hundreds of enslaved workers labored in fields stretching all the way to the horizon, and of the songs they sang to make the endless work bearable. She told them about the ocean, vast and blue-green, nothing like the cold, iron-colored Atlantic that bordered Massachusetts. The girls were transfixed. They had never traveled beyond Salem and its immediate surroundings. The world Tituba described felt exotic, almost impossible to imagine. They begged her for more stories, and Tituba gave them more. Night after night, when circumstances allowed, she told them about the many peoples who lived in Barbados, Africans from different kingdoms, indigenous people from the mainland, Europeans from England, Spain, Portugal, and Holland, all living together in ways that would have been unthinkable in Puritan New England. And then, because the girls pleaded for something frightening, she told them about the obeah practitioners she had known, people who could read the future in eggs and water, who understood which plants could heal and which could kill, who believed the world contained forces the English ministers never mentioned in their sermons. She should not have done it. Even as the words left her mouth, she knew she was making a terrible mistake. But there was power in being listened to, in seeing these privileged white girls lean forward with wide eyes, hanging on every word she spoke. For a few stolen hours, Tituba was not invisible. She was the center of attention, the keeper of knowledge, the one who held power. It was intoxicating and dangerous in equal measure. The sessions continued, always in secret. Tituba taught them small practices, how to crack an egg into a glass of water and read the shapes the white made as it spread, how to listen to the wind moving through the chimney and tell ordinary sounds from something else. She showed them herbs from the small corner of the garden she carefully tended and explained what each was used for. Pennyroyal for women's troubles, tansy for fever, foxglove for the heart, though it could kill if taken in the wrong amount. It was ordinary knowledge, the kind carried by women throughout the Caribbean, the kind that kept people alive in a world without doctors or apothecaries. But in Puritan New England, it was something very different. Knowledge of herbs was acceptable when practiced by English goodwives who had learned it from their mothers. When it came from a dark-skinned woman from the Caribbean, it became suspect. It reeked of popery, of heathen customs, of the folk practices a church condemned as devil worship. Tituba must have known this. She had lived in Massachusetts for more than 2 years by then, long enough to understand how differently her knowledge was viewed. Yet she continued anyway, perhaps because the risk felt small compared to the reward of those rare hours when she was treated as something other than property. And Putnam Jr., 12 years old and the daughter of the powerful Thomas Putnam, learned about the gatherings from Abigail. The two girls had become friendly at church meetings, and Abigail, proud of her secret access to forbidden knowledge, could not resist hinting at it, and demanded to be included, and brought others with her. Elizabeth Hubbard, 17, who lived with the village doctor. Mary Walcott, 16, from another prominent family. Mercy Lewis, 19, a servant in the Putnam household who had survived an indigenous raid that killed her parents. The circle grew to include 8 or 9 girls ranging in age from 9 to 19. They gathered in the Paris kitchen on late January afternoons, supposedly for prayer and needlework, but in truth to listen to the tuba describe a world so unlike their frozen, tightly controlled existence that it might as well have been another planet. They practiced the egg and glass divination, try to glimpse the shapes of future husbands. They learned the properties of herbs. They listened to stories of people who could see the future, speak with the dead, and influence events through ritual and knowledge. For the girls, it was exhilarating. Their lives were bound by strict Puritan rules. No dancing, No singing except psalms, no games, no frivolity of any kind. Their futures were already written: marriage, childbirth, endless household labor, and early death. The knowledge Tituba offered hinted at other possibilities, other ways of holding power and agency in a world that denied them both. What none of them realized was that Tituba was being watched. Reverend Paris had noticed changes in his daughter, a new brightness in her eyes, whispered conversations with Abigail that stopped abruptly when he entered the room. At first, he suspected childish mischief, perhaps the dangers or frivolity that led to dancing or singing, sins that could corrupt a young soul. He began to spy on his own household, listening at doors, peering through cracks in the floorboard from a room above. What he heard disturbed him deeply. Tituba speaking of practices he recognized as witchcraft, his daughter and niece participating with enthusiasm, other village girls involved as well. This was exactly the corruption he had warned against from the pulpit, Satan working through the most innocent-seeming vessels to establish his kingdom. Yet Paris did not act at once. He was a calculating man, acutely aware of how precarious his position was. An accusation of witchcraft was serious and could easily backfire on the accuser if it could not be proven. He needed certainty. He needed evidence. So he continued to watch and listen, gathering information and waiting for the right moment. That moment came in late January, when Betty Paris began to suffer fits. They began as violent nightmares that woke the household in terror. The 9-year-old would sit straight up in bed, eyes wide yet unfocused, screaming about flames and demons. Mrs. Paris rushed to comfort her, but Betty did not seem to recognize her own mother. She spoke in a strange voice, sometimes cry out words that made no sense, sometimes going rigid and silent for long minutes. The fits escalated rapidly. Soon Betty was having episodes during the day, crying out in pain, twisting her body into unnatural positions. She would suddenly freeze in the middle of a task, staring at something no one else could see. She complained of being pricked by invisible needles, of a crushing pressure on her chest that made it difficult for her to breathe. At one point, she tried to hurl herself into fire and had to be physically restrained. Reverend Paris was initially convinced this was divine punishment for some hidden sin within his household. He led hours-long prayer sessions, pleading with God to reveal what transgression had brought this affliction upon his daughter. But the fits only grew worse. Betty began to suffer violent convulsions, her body jerking uncontrollably. She made sounds like a barking dog or a hissing cat. She tried to bite anyone who came close to her. The village doctor, William Griggs, was summoned. He was an elderly man with limited medical training, educated through apprenticeship rather than formal schooling. He examined Betty carefully, checking for fever, looking for signs of disease, questioning her diet and daily habits. He found nothing physically wrong. Her pulse was strong, her complexion healthy, no visible signs of illness. And yet something was clearly and terribly wrong. After several visits, Dr. Griggs finally spoke the words that would doom Salem. The evil hand is upon her. In the medical understanding of the time, this was a diagnosis of last resort, when no natural cause could be found for an illness, especially one marked by strange behavior and convulsions. Supernatural explanations were considered. The evil hand meant witchcraft. Someone was using occult power to torment the child. The diagnosis spread to the village like wildfire. The minister's daughter was bewitched. Satan had struck at the heart of the godly community. If even the minister's own household was not safe, then no one was. Within days, Abigail Williams began exhibiting similar symptoms. She suffered fits in which she screamed and convulsed. She claimed to see specters, ghostly figures that tormented her. She tried to climb up the chimney, insisting she could fly. She spoke in voices that did not sound like her own. The afflictions of the two girls seemed to feed off one another, each episode in one triggering a response in the other. Then in Putnam began to have fits. Then Elizabeth Hubbard. Then Mary Walcott. The affliction spread among the girls who had gathered into Tituba's circle, each developing nearly identical symptoms. They would freeze in the middle of conversation or suddenly cry out as if being stabbed by invisible needles. They reported visions, dark shapes lurking in corners, animals that spoke with human voices, women flying to the night sky. The pattern was strikingly consistent across all the afflicted girls. They experienced sudden fits of screaming and convulsions, periods of rigid paralysis, sensations of being pricked, pinched, or bitten by unseen forces, visions of specters invisible to others, speaking in strange voices or unfamiliar languages, attempt at dangerous acts such as running into fires or climbing chimneys, and physical contortions that seem beyond what their bodies should have been capable of. Modern medical historians have proposed many explanations for these symptoms. Some suggest ergot poisoning from contaminated rye, a fungus known to cause convulsions and hallucinations. Others point to encephalitis, epilepsy, or psychological explanations such as mass hysteria or conversion disorder. Some argue the girls were deliberately faking, engaged in a coordinated fraud. But in February of 1692, there was only one explanation that made sense to the people of Salem: witchcraft. Someone was using demonic power to torment innocent children. The only question was who. The village descended into panic. Families gathered for prayer meetings that lasted for hours, begging God protect them from invisible evil. Reverend Paris delivered sermons about Satan's direct assault on the godly, about the necessity of rooting out witches who had made a covenant with the devil. The Putnam family, powerful and influential, demanded decisive action. If Satan had gained a foothold in Salem village, it was the duty of the righteous to destroy it. But there was a problem. The afflicted girls could not, or would not, name their tormentors. When asked who was afflicting them, they cried out in pain, claiming the witches were choking them to prevent them from speaking. This continued for weeks, building fear and tension throughout the community. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted on the girls to identify the guilty. Their families questioned them relentlessly. Reverend Paris interrogated Betty and Abigail for hours at a time. Village leaders made it clear that the crisis could not be resolved until the witches were named. The girls were the only ones who could see the specters, the only ones who could identify the guilty. The entire community depended on them. It is impossible to know what was going through their minds during this period. Were they genuinely experiencing something they believed to be supernatural attacks? Were they caught in a shared delusion, each girl's symptoms reinforcing the others? Were they consciously fabricating their afflictions, enjoying the attention and the power it brought? Or was it some mixture of all three, perhaps beginning with genuine illness or psychological distress, and then shaped by adult expectations and relentless pressure? What is clear is that by late February, the girls were ready to name names, and the names they chose were not random. On February 25, 1692, arrest warrants were issued for 3 women, Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. The selection of these 3 was deliberate, though later accounts would claim the afflicted girls named them spontaneously during fits. Each woman had been chosen for her vulnerability. Sarah Good was around 40 years old, though hardship made her appear older. She had once belonged to a respectable family, but her father's suicide and the legal disputes that followed had left her destitute. Her first husband died deeply in debt, and her second husband, William Good, was a day laborer who could barely provide for them. They were homeless, drifting from place to place, sleeping in barns and begging for food and shelter. Sarah was known for her sharp tongue and for cursing those who refused her charity. She smoked a pipe, an unusual habit for a woman, and had given birth to a baby girl only months earlier. The infant was sickly. Sarah Good embodied everything Puritans associated with witchcraft: poverty, anger, social marginalization. Sarah Osborne was in her late 50s and confined to her bed by illness. Years earlier, she had scandalized the community by living with her second husband before marrying him. She had also been locked in a bitter legal dispute with the Putnam family over land. She rarely attended church, making her suspect in society that equated religious devotion with moral worth. Claiming that illness kept her confined to her bed. Like Sarah Good, She was already marked as different and troublesome, someone the community would readily believe capable of witchcraft. And then there was Tituba, enslaved, dark-skinned, foreign, known to possess knowledge of herbs and Caribbean practices. She was the ideal scapegoat, legally powerless, with no family to defend her and no social standing that would allow her to refuse anything demanded of her. But Tituba was also the key. The Putnam family had been asking questions and quietly gathering information. They knew about the gatherings in the kitchen, the stories, the egging glass divinations. They knew she had taught the girls practices that could easily be interpreted as witchcraft. They knew she was vulnerable, and they understood that if they could force her to confess, it would validate everything. The girls' afflictions, the existence of a witchcraft conspiracy, and the need for a harsh prosecution. What they did not realize was that Tituba had already made her decision. She had seen what was coming. She had watched the affliction spread, heard the whispers growing louder, felt the net tightening around her. She knew she would be accused, and she had decided in advance how she would respond. The preliminary examinations were held in the Salem Village Meeting House on March 1st. The building was packed to capacity. Nearly every villager came to witness the spectacle. People stood shoulder to shoulder in the aisles, crowded into the gallery, pressed against the walls. Fear and anticipation crackled in the air. Magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin had traveled from Salem town to conduct the examinations. Hathorne was a wealthy merchant and influential politician, a man of considerable authority in the colony. He was also a firm believer in the reality of witchcraft and the necessity of prosecuting it without mercy. He conducted the examinations not as impartial inquiries, but as prosecutions, assuming guilt and pressing relentlessly for confession. The afflicted girls were seated prominently, surrounded by family members who steadied them when the fits came. Betty and Abigail Paris, and Putnam Jr. Elizabeth Hubbard, Mary Walcott, Mercy Lewis. They ranged in age from 9 to 19, yet in that moment they wielded more power than anyone else in the room. Their words would determine who lived and who died. Sarah Good was questioned first. She was brought forward looking haggard and defiant, her infant cradled in her arms. Hathorne opened with an accusation disguised as a question. Sarah Good, what evil spirit have you familiarity with? None, Sarah replied. Have you made no covenant with the devil? No, why do you hurt these children? I do not hurt them. I scorn it. The magistrate pressed her, repeating the same accusations in slightly different forms, trying to trap her in contradictions. Sarah denied everything with stubborn defiance, insisting she was innocent, that she had never harmed the children and never made any pact with the devil. Her denials were repeatedly interrupted by the afflicted girls, who began writhing and screaming, claiming that Sarah's specter was tormenting them even as she stood before the court. Sarah Good, do you not see now what you've done? Hathorne demanded, why do you not tell us the truth? Why do you thus torment these poor children? I do not torment them, Sarah insisted. Who do you employ then to do it? I employ nobody. What creature do you employ then? No creature. I am falsely accused. The examination dragged on for hours. The girls continued to convulse, crying out that Sarah's specter was choking them, stabbing them with invisible needles. At one point, Sarah's own husband, William Good, was called to testify. He stated that he feared his wife either was a witch or soon would be, claiming she was an enemy to all that was good. This testimony was devastating. In Puritan society, a husband was expected to defend and protect his wife. William Good's willingness to testify against Sarah suggested that even her closest relation believed her guilty. The magistrates treated it as powerful evidence. After hours of questioning that produced no confession, Sarah continued to deny everything. The girls continued to accuse her. She was taken away to be held for a trial. Sarah Osborne was examined next. She was carried in on a chair, too weak to stand for long. She also denied all charges, growing increasingly frantic as the magistrates dismissed her protests. She pleaded that she had been ill for months. How could she be tormenting children, when she could barely rise from her bed. The devil may appear in your shape and do mischief without your knowledge or consent, Hathorne suggested, introducing the idea of spectral evidence that would become central to the trials. The theory held that a witch's specter, her ghostly form, could leave her body and torment others while she herself was elsewhere. This made defense nearly impossible. An alibi meant nothing if one specter could act independently. The afflicted girls erupted into fits. Abigail Williams screamed that Sarah Osborne's specter was pressing on her chest, suffocating her. And Putnam cried out that she saw Sarah's specter accompanied by a yellow bird that sucked between her fingers. The bird, they claimed, was a familiar spirit, a demon in animal form that served the witch. Sarah Osborne protested her innocence, but then she made a fatal mistake. She mentioned that she had once been frightened by something like an Indian, all black, that appeared to her in a dream. The magistrates seized on this immediately. She had seen a demon. She had admitted to a supernatural encounter. To them, this was proof of guilt. The elderly woman was dragged away in tears, still insisting she was innocent and had never harmed anyone. Then Tituba was brought forward. She stood before the magistrates, a dark-skinned woman in a plain gray dress, her eyes lowered. Reverend Parris sat in the front row, his face rigid. He had beaten her the night before, demanding to know what she had done to his daughter. The welts on her back throbbed with every breath. Tituba knew exactly what they wanted from her. More importantly, she knew what they needed. The meeting house fell completely silent. People leaned forward, straining to hear. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The examination of the foreign woman, the one accused of bringing heathen practices into their godly community. Magistrate Hathorne asked the first question. Tituba, what evil spirit have you familiarity with? She lifted her eyes and met his gaze directly. For a long moment, she said nothing. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant. Then, in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the room, she began to speak. Corner of the crowded meeting house. She spoke clearly. The devil came to me and bid me serve him. The room exploded. Gasps filled the air. People cried out to God. This was the first confession, after hours of flat denials from the other two women. Here was confirmation that witchcraft truly walked among them. Here was proof that the girls' afflictions were real, that the devil was indeed at work in Salem Village. Hathorne leaned forward, eager. Who had she seen with the devil? And Tituba began to speak. She described a tall man from Boston, dressed entirely in black, who came to her and demanded that she sign his book with blood. Sometimes, she said, he appeared as a man, other times as a dog, other times as a hog. He showed her a book with 9 names written in it, though she could not read most of them. She recognized Sarah Good's name there and Sarah Osborne's. There were others as well, but she did not know who they were. What did the devil promise you if you would serve him? Hathorne asked. He said he would give me many fine things, Tituba replied. What did he want you to do? He wanted me to hurt the children. And did you hurt them? At this, Tituba paused. Tears streamed down her face. He made me hurt them. I tried not to, but he was too powerful. He hurt me when I refused. She showed marks on her arms, bruises that could have come from many causes, but which she claimed were punishments inflicted by the devil himself. The magistrates questioned her for hours that first day. The crowd listened, utterly transfixed. Tituba's testimony was everything they had hoped for and more. She described her encounters with the devil in vivid detail. He came to her at night, she said, first appearing as a tall man with white hair, dressed in black clothes like a minister. He told her she must serve him or he would kill her. He showed her his book and demanded she sign it. When she refused, he hurt her, pinching her and threatening worse. Eventually, she said, she gave in. She signed the book, not with ink, but with blood. The devil pricked her finger, and she made her mark. After that, he had power over her. He commanded her to hurt the children, and she had no choice but to obey. How did you hurt them? Hathorne asked. He gave me things to use. Tituba said, "Poppets, little dolls made of rags." He told me to stick pins in them, and when I did, the children would feel pain. Where are these poppets now? I do not know. He took them away. Who else had she seen with the devil? I saw Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, Tituba said. They were at a meeting with the devil. There were others too. A tall man with white hair and a woman with white hair. I did not know their names. This was crucial. Tituba was not describing isolated acts of witchcraft. She was describing conspiracy, a coven of witches meeting together with the devil himself. This confirmed the magistrate's darkest fears. It was not a few scattered cases. It was an organized assault on the godly community. Where did these meetings take place? Hathorne demanded. At the minister's house, Tituba said, and the crowd gasped. They came at night, flying through the air. The devil brought them. How did they fly? On sticks like poles. They rode through the air. Did you fly with them? Yes, Tituba admitted. The devil made me. We flew to Boston and back in one night. This detail, the flight to Boston, was especially alarming. It suggested that the witchcraft conspiracy extended beyond Salem Village, reaching even into the provincial capital. The threat was far larger than anyone had imagined. The examination continued into a second day, then a third. Each session drew larger crowds. People traveled from surrounding towns to hear Tituba speak. She became the central witness, the one who could reveal the full scope of the conspiracy. And with each retelling, her testimony expanded. She added new details, described more encounters, hinted at more participants without naming them outright. She spoke of a yellow bird the devil gave her as a familiar spirit, one that sucked blood from between her fingers. She described a black dog that appeared to her and demanded she serve the devil, a red cat and a black cat that were also familiar spirits. Midnight rides through the air to secret meetings. A white-haired woman and a tall white-haired man who were also witches, though she did not know their names. The Devil's Book, with its 9 names, suggesting 9 witches operating in the area. She wept often as she spoke, insisting she wanted to return to God, that she had been forced into the devil's service against her will. She begged forgiveness and promised to tell everything she knew if it would help capture the other witches. It was brilliant in its own way. Every detail was vivid enough to sound true, yet vague enough to be impossible to verify. She gave the magistrates exactly what they wanted, not just a confession, but proof of a vast hidden conspiracy. The hysteria that would consume Salem in the months to come was built on those 3 days of testimony. But there was something else embedded in Tituba's words, something the magistrates did not consciously register, but that sharper listeners noticed immediately. She was describing real people. When she spoke of the tall man from Boston, certain families exchanged quick glances. When she mentioned the white-haired woman, whispers rippled through particular sections of the crowd. Tituba was settling accounts. Consider what she was doing. She was an enslaved woman with no legal rights, no property, no power. She had been beaten, threatened, accused of a crime that carried a death sentence. She could have denied everything, as Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne had done. But she had seen the result. Their denials were ignored. They were presumed guilty regardless, and execution was likely. So Tituba chose another path. She confessed, but she confessed strategically. She told a story that confirmed everything the magistrates already believed about witchcraft, while at the same time implicating people who had harmed her or whom she had reason to fear or resent. The tall man from Boston, dressed in black like a minister, could have described any number of merchants or officials who had passed through Paris's household. The white-haired woman could have been Sarah Osborne, yes, but it could also have been someone else entirely. Also resembled other women in the village who had treated Tituba cruelly. She was casting her accusations in broad, suggestive strokes, allowing others to fill in specific faces based on their own resentments and grievances. And it worked. In the months that followed, as more people were accused, Many of them fit the descriptions Tituba had already provided. She had given Salem a template for identifying witches, and the villagers embraced it with terrifying enthusiasm. On the third day of her examination, as her testimony began to wind down, Magistrate Hathorn made a crucial decision. Tituba's confession was too valuable, too detailed, to waste. Unlike the other two women, she would not be tried immediately. Instead, she would be held as a witness against others. The authorities needed her alive to build cases against the larger conspiracy she claimed to have uncovered. Tituba was led away to jail. Through her words, she had saved her own life, at least for the moment. Sarah Osborne and Sarah Good would not be so fortunate. Sarah Osborne died in prison from illness in May. Sarah Good was hanged on Gallows Hill in July. Tituba survived because she had given Salem what it desperately wanted. Not merely a witch, but a doorway into a hidden world of evil. The problem was that once that doorway was open, it could not be closed. March of 1692 bled into April, and the accusation spread like a contagion. The afflicted girls, emboldened by the magistrate's faith in their suffering and empowered by the attention their afflictions brought them, began naming more and more people. And the names they chose revealed the true nature of what was happening in Salem Village. On March 11th, Martha Corey was accused. The accusation stunned the community. Martha was a full church member, a woman known for her piety and keen intelligence. Her fatal mistake had been expressing doubt about the girls' afflictions, suggesting they might be pretending. She had also questioned the validity of spectral evidence. If the devil could appear in someone's shape without their consent, how could guilt ever be proven? Her skepticism made her dangerous. The logic was circular and inescapable. Only a witch would question the existence of witchcraft. Only someone allied with the devil would doubt the girl's testimony. Martha's intelligence and independence, traits that might have been admired in a man, made her suspect as a woman. When Martha was examined on March 21st, the afflicted girls staged their most dramatic display yet. They mirrored her every movement. When she shifted her weight, they shifted theirs. When she bit her lip, they screamed that they were being bitten. When she wrung her hands, they cried out that their hands were being twisted. It was a grotesque pantomime, and the magistrates accepted it as proof of guilt. Clearly, they reasoned, she was controlling the girls through witchcraft, forcing them to imitate her actions. Martha attempted to defend herself with reason and logic. She pointed out the absurdity of the accusations, the complete absence of physical evidence. But logic had no place in these proceedings. She was sent to jail to await trial. On March 23rd, Rebecca Nurse was accused. This was even more shocking than Martha Corey's arrest. Rebecca was 71 years old, a grandmother so devout that she was respected even by those who disagreed with her family on other matters. She was hard of hearing and physically frail. The idea that this elderly, deeply pious woman could be a witch seemed impossible. But Rebecca's family, the Nurses, had been involved for years in a bitter land dispute with the Putnam family. The Nurses had purchased land the Putnams believed should have belonged to them. The courts had ruled in favor of the Nurses, but the Putnams had never accepted the decision. Now, under the cover of the witch hunt, old grudges could be settled, and Putnam Jr. became Rebecca's primary accuser, claiming Rebecca's specter tormented her. And Putnam Sr., the girl's mother, soon began exhibiting afflictions of her own and accused Rebecca of murdering several of her infant children through witchcraft. This accusation was especially cruel, and Putnam Sr. had indeed lost multiple children, a tragic but common reality in colonial New England. Now, those natural deaths were being reimagined as acts of supernatural malice. Rebecca Nurse's examination was heartbreaking. The old woman struggled to hear the questions put to her. She stood confused and frightened as the girls writhed and screamed, accusing her of tormenting them. In a weak but steady voice, she proclaimed her innocence. "I can say before my eternal Father, I am innocent, and God will clear my innocency." But God did not clear her, at least not in the eyes of the magistrates. She was sent to jail, and her arrest sent a chilling message through the colony. No one was safe. If Rebecca Nurse could be accused, anyone could be. The pattern became unmistakable. Anyone who questioned the proceedings, who expressed doubt about the girl's visions, became suspect themselves. Opposition was treated as proof of guilt. The witch hunt had developed an internal logic that fed on itself, making it nearly impossible to stop. By the end of March, more than a dozen people had been accused and arrested. By the end of April, the number had risen to over 30. The jails in Salem, Ipswich, and Boston overflowed. Men and women from Salem Village and neighboring communities were crammed into cells meant to hold far fewer prisoners. Conditions were horrific. Prisoners were kept in chains, not simple handcuffs, but heavy iron shackles on wrists and ankles, sometimes bolted to the walls. The weight of the iron caused wounds, cutting into flesh and making even the smallest movement agonizing. Cells were dark, cold, and filthy. Prisoners received little food and were required to pay for their own imprisonment. Fees were charged for each day in jail for the chains, even for the arrest warrant itself. Those who could not pay suffered the worst conditions. Sarah Good gave birth in jail while still manacled. The infant died within days. Sarah's 4-year-old daughter, Dorcas, was also arrested after the afflicted girls claimed the child's specter bit them. Little Dorcas was placed in chains so heavy she could barely move. She survived physically, but the psychological damage never fully healed. She would remain traumatized for the rest of her life. The accusations followed clear patterns that exposed their true purpose. Those accused were often people involved in property disputes with the accusers' families, those who had challenged the proceedings, those who had expressed skepticism, those who were vulnerable, isolated, or already marginalized within the community. Already marginalized, the poor, the elderly, the socially awkward, those whose families had opposed Reverend Parris or supported his enemies, women who were seen as too independent, too outspoken, too wealthy, or too poor, and anyone who had made enemies in the small, claustrophobic world of Salem Village. Behind the public spectacle, a far more calculated campaign was taking shape. At its center stood the Putnam family. Thomas Putnam was the most influential man in Salem Village despite never holding formal high office. His family had been among the earliest settlers, and he owned substantial land, though never as much as he believed he deserved. His fathers had disappointed him deeply, leaving significant property to a stepmother Thomas despised. Several land disputes with neighbors had ended unfavorably for him. He supported Reverend Parris with fierce loyalty, seeing in the minister a powerful ally against the Salem town elite who looked down on village farmers. His wife and Putnam Sr. had endured repeated personal tragedies. She had suffered multiple miscarriages and the deaths of 7 children in infancy or early childhood. These losses left her embittered and convinced that supernatural forces were actively working against her family. In March, she herself began experiencing afflictions, lending adult authority to the girls' testimonies. At 30 years old, she was the oldest of the afflicted, and her accusations carried particular weight. Their daughter, and Putnam Jr., was 12 years old and the most prolific of all the accusers. She would ultimately accuse 62 people of witchcraft, more than any other individual. Later historians would note a striking pattern. Nearly every person she accused had some connection to the Putnam family's grievances. They were people who won land disputes against the Putnams, families who supported rival factions in village politics, or individuals who had questioned Reverend Parris's claims to certain properties. But when Junior was a child, someone was guiding her accusations, supplying names, framing old resentments in the language of visions and spectral torment. That someone was her mother and Putnam Sr., who by March had begun having afflictions of her own. Together, the Putnam women, mother and daughter, became the twin engines driving the witch hunt forward. The magistrates never questioned this pattern because it aligned perfectly with their worldview. Satan, they believed, would naturally target a godly family like the Putnams. The fact that accusations mirrored worldly disputes was simply further proof, in their minds, that the devil worked through earthly grievances to divide communities. No serious investigations were conducted. No claims were verified. Spectral evidence, testimony that a witch's ghost or demonic form had appeared to cause harm, became sufficient grounds for arrest and prosecution. In May, the crisis escalated to an entirely new level. A new governor arrived in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Sir William Phips found his province in chaos, with jails overflowing with accused witches and no clear legal structure for trying them. The previous governor had been recalled to England, leaving the colony in administrative limbo. Phips had been appointed to restore order, but instead, he stepped into a situation spiraling rapidly out of control. Phips quickly established a special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, with authority to hear and decide the witchcraft cases. The judges were drawn from the colony's elite. William Stoughton, the lieutenant governor, served as chief justice. The other judges included Samuel Sewell, John Richards, Nathaniel Saltonstall, Waite Winthrop, Bartholomew Gedney, John Hathorne, and Jonathan Corwin. These were powerful men who firmly believed in the reality of a witchcraft conspiracy. Stoughton, in particular, was an uncompromising hardliner, absolutely convinced that Satan had established a kingdom in Massachusetts and that only ruthless prosecution could destroy it. He would become the driving force behind the executions that followed. The court's first session was scheduled for early June. Before the trials could begin, however, the judges faced a critical legal question. What kind of evidence would be allowed? Under English law, witchcraft was notoriously difficult to prove because it was an invisible crime. You could not see someone making a pact with the devil or casting a spell. Convictions typically required a confession or eyewitness testimony of suspicious acts. The Salem cases, however, relied almost entirely on spectral evidence. Claims by the afflicted that they had seen the accused person's specter tormenting them. The flaw in this kind of evidence was obvious. It was entirely subjective and impossible to verify. If someone claimed your ghost had attacked them, how could you disprove it? You could not. Denial itself was treated as further proof of guilt. It was a perfect trap. Some ministers and legal thinkers expressed serious concerns. Several Boston ministers wrote a letter urging caution, warning that the devil might appear in the shape of innocent people in order to deceive the afflicted. If that were possible, then spectral evidence alone could never prove guilt. But the judges, led by Stoughton, rejected these warnings. They reasoned that God would not allow the devil to assume the form of an innocent person. Such deception, they argued, would contradict divine justice. Therefore, if a person's specter was seen tormenting the afflicted, that person must have granted the devil permission to use their shape, which meant they were guilty. That decision sealed the fate of the accused. With spectral evidence deemed admissible, conviction became almost inevitable. The visions of the afflicted girls, which could neither be challenged nor disproven, became the central evidence in court. The girls, fully aware of the power they now wielded, used it freely. The first trial took place on June 2nd, 1692. Bridget Bishop stood before the Court of Oyer and Terminer, charged with witchcraft. Bridget was around 60 years old, a tavern keeper known for her sharp tongue and flamboyant clothing. She had been married 3 times, an unusual fact for a woman of her time. She wore red bodices and other brightly colored garments that Puritans considered scandalously immodest. Her tavern was a place where people drank and played games like shovelboard, activities strict Puritans viewed with suspicion. She had been accused of witchcraft once before, years earlier, though those charges had been dismissed. Now she faced the court again, and this time there was no intention of letting her go. The evidence against her included spectral testimony from the afflicted girls, who claimed her specter tormented them. Neighbors testified that she had appeared to them in spectral form years earlier. Poppets, small rag dolls with pins stuck into them, were allegedly discovered hidden in the walls of her house during renovations. Claims that she bore a preternatural mark on her body, where familiar spirits could suckle, were especially damaging. According to the folklore of the time, witches were believed to possess such marks, used to feed their demonic familiars. Made dolls meant to represent their victims and stuck pins into them to cause pain. The claim that such dolls had been found inside Bridget's house seemed like tangible, undeniable proof. Bridget denied everything. She insisted she was innocent, that she had never harmed anyone, that she knew nothing of witchcraft at all. But her denials carried no weight. The spectral evidence was considered overwhelming, and the judges were already convinced of her guilt. The trial lasted only a single day. The jury deliberated briefly before returning its verdict. Guilty. Bridget Bishop was hanged on June 10, 1692, on a rocky rise that would later become known as Gallows Hill. She was the first person executed during the Salem Witch Trials, but she would not be the last. After Bridget's execution, there was a brief pause. One of the judges, Nathaniel Saltonstall, resigned from the court, reportedly disturbed by the proceedings and by the heavy reliance on spectral evidence. His protest had little effect. He was quickly replaced, and the trials moved forward without hesitation. The next session of the court was held in late June. 5 women were tried and convicted: Sarah Good, Rebecca Nurse, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. Among these, Rebecca Nurse's case was the most controversial. Despite the spectral accusations against her, dozens of people testified to her good character. 39 members of the community signed a petition declaring their belief in her innocence. The jury initially returned a verdict of not guilty. Chief Justice Stoughton was furious. He sent the jury back to reconsider, pointing out testimony he claimed they had failed to consider. Under intense pressure, the jury reversed its decision and returned a verdict of guilty. Governor Phipps granted Rebecca Nurse a reprieve, but it was swiftly revoked after the afflicted girls erupted into renewed fits, screaming that her specters still tormented them. Rebecca Nurse, 71 years old and devout to the end, was condemned to die. Sarah Good went to the gallows cursing Reverend Nicholas Noyes, who urged her to confess. "You are a liar," she shouted at him. "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." According to later legend, Noyes died years after a hemorrhage, choking on his own blood. The 5 women were hanged together on July 19, 1692. A crowd gathered to watch. The condemned were brought to Gallows Hill in a cart, their hands bound. They were allowed to pray and speak final words, though Sarah Good's curses were almost certainly not what the authorities had hoped to hear. Then, one by one, they were executed. Hanging in colonial New England was not the swift death of modern executions, but a calculated drop designed to break the neck. The condemned climbed a ladder, a noose was placed around their necks, and then the ladder was pulled away. Death came slowly by strangulation. Their bodies jerked and convulsed as they suffocated, sometimes for several minutes. The crowd watched every moment. When the bodies finally fell still, they were cut down and buried in shallow graves nearby. Families were forbidden from claiming the bodies for proper burial. Witches, it was said, did not deserve Christian burial in consecrated ground. Rebecca Nurse's family defied this order. Under cover of darkness, they retrieved her body and buried it secretly on their own land. The exact location was kept hidden for generations, marked only by a small stone to prevent the authorities from discovering and disturbing the grave. August brought more trials and more executions. On August 19th, 5 more people were hanged: George Burroughs, John Proctor, John Willard, George Jacob Sr., and Martha Carrier. George Burroughs was a former minister of Salem Village, a Harvard-educated man who had left the position years earlier after disputes with the congregation. He was accused of being the ringleader of the witches, the black man who presided over their meetings. The evidence against him was thin. He was said to possess unusual strength for his size, able to lift heavy barrels with ease, which was interpreted as proof of supernatural power. He had also been married multiple times, and the deaths of some of his wives were now retroactively deemed suspicious. At the gallows, Burroughs recited the Lord's Prayer flawlessly. This unsettled the crowd, because folklore held that witches could not recite the prayer correctly. Murmurs spread. Perhaps he was innocent after all. But Cotton Mather, The influential Boston minister who had come to witness the execution addressed the crowd from horseback. He reminded them that the devil could appear as an angel of light, and that Burroughs' recitation proved nothing. The execution proceeded. John Proctor had been a vocal critic of the trials, openly calling the afflicted girls liars and frauds. He had written letters to ministers in Boston, begging them to intervene and move the trials there, where calmer judgment might prevail. His opposition made him a target. When he was accused, he understood it as punishment for his resistance. His wife Elizabeth was also accused and convicted, but she was pregnant, and the execution of pregnant women was forbidden. She remained alive in jail and would survive until the trials ended. John Willard had served as a deputy constable involved in arresting accused witches. Over time, he became deeply disturbed by what he saw: the lack of evidence, the obvious innocence of many accused. He refused to make further arrests. Soon after, he himself was accused. The message was unmistakable. You were either part of the witch hunt or an enemy of it, and opposition itself was evidence of guilt. George Jacobs Sr. was 80 years old and so frail that he needed 2 canes to walk. His own granddaughter, Margaret Jacobs, testified against him. She would later recant, admitting she had been coerced and had lied. But by then it was far too late. Martha Carrier was described by Cotton Mather as a rampant hag. She was sharp-tongued and refused to submit quietly to authority. She had also been involved in a property dispute with the Putnam family. Her children were arrested and tortured until they testified against her. Faced with seeing their children chained and threatened with worse, several accused witches' children gave false testimony against their own parents. September brought the final executions. On September 22nd, 8 more people were hanged: Mary Easty, Martha Corey, and Putiator, Samuel Wardwell, Mary Parker, Alice Parker, Wilmot Red, and Margaret Scott. Putiator, Samuel Wardwell, Mary Parker, Alice Parker, Wilmot Red, and Margaret Scott. Mary Easty was the sister of Rebecca Nurse. She had briefly been released after her initial arrest, but when the afflicted girls renewed their fits, she was taken back into custody. From jail, she wrote a petition to the judges that remains one of the most powerful and eloquent documents of the trials. I petition to your honors not for my own life, for I know I must die and my appointed time is set, but that no more innocent blood may be shed. I would humbly beg of you that your honors would be pleased to examine these afflicted persons strictly and keep them apart some time, and likewise to try some of these confessing witches. I being confident there are several of them have belied themselves and others. She was asking the judges to do what they should have done from the very beginning: test the testimony of the afflicted girls, separate them to see whether their stories remained consistent, question the confessions that had been extracted through fear, pressure, and coercion. Her plea was ignored. She was hanged alongside the others. Martha Corey, the church member who had dared to question proceedings, went to her death maintaining her innocence. Her husband, Giles Corey, had already died in a particularly horrific manner. Giles was 80 years old, a stubborn and abrasive farmer who had initially supported the trials, only to turn against them once his wife was accused. He himself was arrested soon afterward, but Giles refused to enter a plea. He would not say guilty or not guilty. Under English law, a person who refused to plead could not be tried. This posed a problem for the authorities, because if he was not tried, his property could not be confiscated. Giles was protecting his son's inheritance. The officials had a solution: peine forte et dure, hard and forceful punishment. Giles was stripped and laid on the ground. A wooden board was placed across his chest, and heavy stones were stacked on top of it, one by one. The crushing weight was meant to force him to enter a plea. Giles refused. For 2 days he lay there as the weight increased, his ribs breaking, his breathing growing shallower. Witnesses later said that when the sheriff asked him to plead, Giles's only response was, "More weight." He died on September 19th, crushed to death without ever entering a plea. His property passed to his sons. It was a final act of defiance, purchased at a terrible cost. By the end of September, 19 people had been hanged, one had been pressed to death, and at least 5 more had died in prison. Dozens of others still awaited trial. The jails were overflowing. Families had been shattered. The community was traumatized. And through all of this, Tituba sat in her cell. The magistrates had lost interest in her. As more sensational suspects emerged, they already had her confession on record. They no longer needed her testimony for the trials that followed. Her detailed confession had served its purpose. It had validated the idea of a witchcraft conspiracy and provided a framework for understanding the girl's afflictions. Once that framework was in place, Tituba herself became expendable. Reverend Paris, who legally owned her, refused to pay her jail fees. In the strange accounting of the time, prisoners were required to pay for their own imprisonment. A daily fee for cell for the chains, for meager food, even for the arrest warrant itself. If a prisoner was executed, their property was seized to cover the cost. But Tituba occupied an unusual legal limbo. She had confessed and provided information. She was guilty yet useful, enslaved yet unpaid for. Paris's refusal to pay her fees amounted to abandonment. He could have paid and reclaimed his property, but he chose not to. Perhaps he could not afford it. His salary was still in arrears, and his finances were strained. Perhaps he was ashamed, humiliated that his own enslaved woman had been the first to confess to witchcraft. Or perhaps he simply wanted to forget she existed, to erase the reminder of how the entire nightmare had begun. In the dimness of the jail, Tituba had time to think. She shared her cell with other accused women and listened to them. She heard their stories, their claims of innocence, their bewilderment over who had accused them and why. Gradually, a pattern emerged in those whispered conversations, one Tituba had suspected from the beginning, but now saw confirmed. The accusations followed lines of property disputes, family rivalries, and petty grudges elevated to cosmic importance. Rebecca Nurse's family had been locked in land disputes with the Putnams. John Proctor had openly called the afflicted girls frauds. Martha Corey had questioned the proceedings themselves. George Burroughs had left Salem Village years earlier under bitter circumstances. Again and again, each accusation could be traced back to some ordinary conflict, now recast as spiritual warfare. Tituba understood this because she had helped create the pattern. Her testimony had been strategic from the start. The tall man from Boston she described wore clothing similar to that of wealthy merchants who had occasionally visited Reverend Paris before he moved to Salem Village. Men involved in business disputes with him. The white-haired woman resembled Sarah Osborne, yes, but also bore similarities to other women in the village who had treated Tituba harshly. She had painted her accusations in broad strokes, allowing others to insert specific faces drawn from their own resentments. She had weaponized the magistrate's fears and the community's paranoia, and had worked far beyond anything she could have imagined. But by autumn, the trials were beginning to collapse under their own weight. The problem was that the accusations kept spreading. Too many people had been named, including increasingly powerful and respected citizens. Wives of merchants were accused. Ministers' relatives were cried out upon. Eventually, even Governor Phipps's own wife, Lady Mary Phipps, was named by the afflicted girls. This marked a turning point. When accusations reached the very top of colonial society, the men in power grew suddenly cautious. The spectral evidence that had seemed so convincing when applied to marginal figures like Sarah Good or Rebecca Nurse now appeared dangerously unreliable when it threatened the governor's family. If anyone could be accused based solely on visions and dreams, then no one was safe. The same men who had driven the trials forward began to fear for themselves. There were other cracks forming as well. Several of the so-called confessing witches began to recant their statements, saying they had lied under torture or coercion. Margaret Jacobs, who had testified against her grandfather, George Jacobs Sr., publicly recanted, admitting she had been forced to lie. She wrote, "They told me if I would not confess, I should be put down into the dungeon and would be hanged. But if I would confess, I should save my life." The confessions that had been treated as proof of a vast conspiracy were now exposed as products of fear, pressure, and abuse. If the confessions were false, then what did that mean for the entire machinery of the trials? In October, Reverend Increase Mather, one of the most influential ministers in the colony and the father of Cotton Mather, published a treatise titled Cases of Conscience concerning evil spirits. In it, he directly questioned the use of spectral evidence. One line in particular would echo through history. It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned. This was a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the trials. Increase Mather was no marginal critic. He was the president of Harvard College, a man whose opinion carried enormous weight. His treatise was endorsed by 14 other prominent ministers. The message was unmistakable. The trials had gone too far, and the methods being used were fundamentally unsound. Governor Phipps, sensing the political wind shift and increasingly worried about the safety of his own wife, dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer on October 29, 1692. The trials were halted. A new superior court was established with strict limitations on evidence. Spectral testimony was no longer sufficient for conviction. Confessions obtained through coercion were ruled inadmissible. Physical, verifiable evidence was now required. The new court convened in January of 1693. Of the 52 people tried under these new standards, only 3 were convicted, and Governor Phipps quickly pardoned them. By May of 1693, all remaining accused individuals had been released or formally pardoned. The witch hunt was over. The final toll was staggering. 19 people hanged. 1 person pressed to death. At least 5 more died in prison. More than 200 people accused. Dozens of families destroyed. An entire community traumatized for generations. Except for Tituba. She remained in jail because Reverend Parris refused to pay her prison fees. Under the strange and brutal economics of the time, she could not be released until someone paid the cost of her imprisonment. Months passed. Other prisoners returned home to rebuild shattered lives. Families sought restitution for loved ones who had been executed or jailed. Salem struggled to understand how neighbors had turned on one another with such ferocity. Tituba remained in her cell through the winter of 1693. Into spring and through the summer, Parris made no effort to retrieve her. He left her to rot, whether out of poverty, resentment, shame, or a desire to erase the living reminder of how the entire nightmare had begun. She was his property, but she was also his accusation, the first confession that had validated the hysteria. Perhaps he could not face her. Perhaps he simply wanted to pretend she had never existed. The conditions of her continued imprisonment were severe. By this point, she was alone. All other accused had been released or executed. She remained chained in a cold, dark cell. Her food was minimal. No one visited her. She had been forgotten by everyone except the jailer, who continued to charge daily fees for her confinement. In April of 1693, 13 months after her arrest, an unknown person paid Tituba's prison fees. The amount was £7, a significant sum equivalent to several months' wages for a laborer. The jail records note only that the fees were paid in full, with no name attached. Tituba was released and immediately sold to a new owner to satisfy the debt. The transaction was recorded in a single line of a ledger. Tituba, Indian woman, sold to name illegible for £7. After that, Tituba vanished from the historical record. No documents record her later life. There is no death notice, no marriage record, no property transfer, no mention in any diary or letter. The woman whose confession had ignited the most infamous witch hunt in American history disappeared, as though she had never existed at all. The official narrative of Salem took shape quickly after the trials ended. Authorities framed the events as a tragic mistake, a delusion perhaps caused by fraud or mass hysteria, exploited by unscrupulous accusers. Judges issued formal apologies, though they were careful to insist they had acted in good faith, based on the evidence available at the time. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, made a public confession of error in 1697, standing in church while his apology was read aloud before the congregation. He was the only judge to do so. William Stoughton, the Chief Justice and driving force behind the executions, never apologized. He maintained until his death that the trials had been justified. The afflicted girls, as they grew older, largely fell silent. Most married and lived quiet lives, rarely if ever speaking publicly about their roles in the trials. And Putnam Jr. eventually issued a public apology in 1706 when she joined the Salem Village Church. Her confession was carefully crafted. "I desire to be humble before God for that sad and humbling providence that befell my father's family in the year about 92, that I then being in my childhood should by such a providence of God be made an instrument for the accusing of several persons of a grievous crime, whereby their lives were taken away from them, whom now I have just grounds and good reason to believe they were innocent persons, and that it was a great delusion of Satan that deceived me in that sad time." She claimed she had been deceived by Satan and had never intended harm. She avoided naming anyone who may have guided or influenced her accusations. She accepted responsibility while denying agency, a masterful act of contrition that satisfied the church without reopening old wounds. And Putnam Jr. died young and unmarried in 1715, having spent much of her later life caring for younger siblings after her parents' deaths. Some historians believe she was haunted by guilt, though no direct evidence survives. Others suggest she simply lived a difficult life in a community that never fully forgot her role in the trials. Reverend Samuel Parris was forced out of Salem Village in 1697 after years of bitter conflict, his ministry permanently stained by the events of 1692. With his congregation, many villagers blamed him for the trials, believing his dark sermons and divisive leadership had created the atmosphere in which the witch hunt could flourish. He left Salem Village owing money and departed without paying for Tituba's replacement. His daughter Betty eventually grew up and married, living a quiet life in concord with no clear evidence of lasting effects from her childhood afflictions. His niece, Abigail Williams, disappeared from the historical record around 1697. Rumors claim she died young, but no grave, death notice, or official record has ever been found. The Putnam family retained influence in Salem Village for another generation, though their reputation was permanently damaged. Thomas Putnam died in 1699. His wife and Putnam Sr. also died that same year. Both died relatively young, only 7 years after trials. Some contemporaries interpreted this as divine judgment. Others noted simply that they had lived hard lives in a harsh era. The executed victims were eventually exonerated, though the process took decades. In 1702, the Massachusetts General Court declared the trials unlawful. In 1711, the colony began paying restitution to survivors and to the families of the victims. The payments were often insultingly small: £20 for a life taken, a few pounds for months of imprisonment. Some families received nothing at all, either because they could not prove their relatives' innocence or because bureaucratic obstacles blocked compensation. In 1957, more than 2.5 centuries later, Massachusetts formally pardoned all those who had been convicted. In 2001, the last 5 victims were officially exonerated by name. The process of acknowledging the injustice took more than 300 years. Tituba, however, was never exonerated because she had never been convicted. Her confession spared her a trial but condemned her to erasure. Colonial authorities had no interest in revisiting the story of the enslaved woman whose words had ignited the entire catastrophe, whose carefully constructed testimony had laid the groundwork for 19 executions. Later historians argued endlessly about Tituba's role. Some portrayed her purely as a victim, beaten and terrorized into confessing. Others suggested she genuinely believed in the spiritual practices she described, that she was drawing on Caribbean folk traditions without understanding how they would be interpreted through a Puritan lens as devil worship. A few recognized what should have been obvious. Tituba was intelligent, perceptive, and desperate, willing to say whatever was necessary to survive, even if it meant condemning others. The truth was likely all of these at once. Tituba had been taken from her homeland, enslaved, dragged across the ocean to a frozen land where she was isolated, exploited, and abused. When Reverend Paris beat her and demanded to know what she had done to his daughter, she faced a brutal choice: maintain her innocence and almost certainly be executed, as Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were, or confess and give the magistrates exactly what they wanted. She chose survival, and in crafting her confession, she was meticulous. She implicated people who had harmed her, while keeping her descriptions vague enough to be interpreted broadly. The tall man from Boston could have been almost anyone. The white-haired woman could be whoever the listeners already suspected. Tituba opened a door and allowed Salem's own darkness to pour through it. Old resentments, land disputes, religious paranoia, rigid social hierarchies, all rebranded as tales of devil worship and spectral torment. But the surviving documentary trail suggests something even more unsettling. In 1957, a historian researching the Salem trials at the Massachusetts Archives discovered a collection of documents that had been misfiled for more than 2 centuries. Marion Starkey was working on her book The Devil in Massachusetts when she found them. The folder was labeled simply Salem Miscellaneous and contained original transcripts of Tituba's examinations. These were not the polished versions published in the early 18th century. They were the raw notes taken by the court recorder during her 3 days of testimony, complete with crossed-out passages, marginal comments, and annotations. What Starkey found was disturbing. Tituba's testimony had been heavily edited before being released to the public. Dozens of specific details had been removed. References to particular merchants in Boston were struck out. Descriptions of activities involving certain prominent families were deleted. Most striking of all, an entire section in which Tituba described being approached by well-dressed gentlemen from Salem town before the trials even began had been completely excised. According to Starkey's notes, in this deleted portion, Tituba described a man who visited the Paris household in late 1691, before the girl's affliction started. He spoke privately with Reverend Paris, but Tituba overheard parts of the conversation. The man discussed the problems in the village and those who oppose godly order. He mentioned specific families by name, families that would later become targets of the witch hunt. Tituba's testimony suggested that this man had effectively provided Paris with a list of enemies, people who were causing trouble for certain interests tied to Salem town. When Tituba later confessed to witchcraft, she incorporated this man into her story as one of the figures she had seen in league with the devil. But the magistrates, recognizing exactly who she was describing, ordered that section removed from the public record. Starkey wrote about these discrepancies in her book, but she framed them cautiously, presenting them as evidence that Tituba had been coached rather than acknowledging what they truly implied. Tituba had known things, specific things, about powerful people in colonial Massachusetts. Her testimony threatened to expose not just village-level grudges, but connections reaching into provincial elite. Shortly after Starkey's research, the documents disappeared. The archives claimed they had been returned to a private collection and were no longer available for study. No historian has been able to examine them since. Marion Starkey herself became notably evasive on the subject in her later years, refusing to discuss the specific passages she had uncovered. In interviews late in her life, she would change the subject whenever asked about the deleted sections of Tituba's testimony. What was in those erased passages? What did Tituba actually know? Consider the timeline. Tituba arrived in Salem Village with Reverend Paris in 1689. Paris had been a merchant in Barbados before turning to the ministry, a failed merchant by most accounts, who sought the clergy after his business ventures collapsed. But Barbados in the 1680s was not just a distant plantation colony. It was a crucial node in the Atlantic world, the center of the British Caribbean slave economy, where fortunes were made in sugar and in human trafficking. The island was also a hub for smuggling, illicit trade, and the kind of shadowy financial dealings that underwrote many of Boston's merchant fortunes. The connection between Barbados and Boston was deep and well established. Many Boston merchants held interests in Caribbean plantations, trading partnerships, and smuggling networks. They needed trusted agents in Barbados to manage those interests, and they needed ministers in Massachusetts who could be relied upon to support the correct political and economic factions. What if Tituba, as an enslaved woman in Paris's household in Barbados, had seen things, overheard conversations, learned names, alliances, and financial connections? Enslaved people were invisible to their owners in the most dangerous way. Masters spoke freely in front of them, assuming they were too ignorant or too fearful to understand or remember. But Tituba was neither ignorant nor forgetful. When Paris brought her to Massachusetts, she would have carried that knowledge with her. She would have recognized the same man who visited Paris and Barbados, now appearing in Salem Village. She would have heard the same names, the same patterns of conversation, the same concerns whispered behind closed doors. And when witch trials began, when she was beaten, interrogated, and threatened with death, she used what she knew. The tall man from Boston was not a demon. He was a real person. Someone tied to Caribbean trade. Someone whose exposure would have been disastrous. The passages Mary and Starkey discovered and later saw disappear likely contain enough detail to identify him and his associates. That is why those sections were removed. That is why, after the trials ended and apologies were issued and exonerations granted, Tituba was allowed to vanish. She knew too much. The unknown person who paid her prison fees in April 1693 and then purchased her was not acting out of mercy. It was containment. Someone bought not only her body but her silence, and then ensured she would never speak again. Salem Village tried to forget. The meeting house where the examinations took place was eventually torn down. The homes of the executed were sold. The accusers married, had children, and told them nothing of what had happened. The village itself was renamed Danvers in 1752, perhaps in hope that a new name might erase the old stain. But memory lingered. People remembered the screaming girls and the packed courtroom. They remembered neighbors led away in chains. They remembered bodies hanging from Gallows Hill, and they remembered that it had all begun with the confession of an enslaved woman. Over the years, stories circulated. Travelers claimed that on certain nights you could still hear screams near the old jail. Others said the site where Gallows Hill once stood, its exact location now deliberately obscured, remained unnaturally cold even in summer. These were the expected ghost stories, the kind that attached themselves to any place of mass death. But there were other stories, quieter ones that never entered the official histories. Stories passed down in families who had lived through the trials, whispered across generations. One such story spoke of a woman matching Tituba's description who appeared in Portsmouth, New Hampshire in the late 1690s. She was enslaved to a merchant family. People noted that she never spoke of her past. She worked in a household, tended the garden, and knew herbs and their uses. She died of smallpox in 1702 and was buried in an unmarked grave. The family paid for an unusually secure coffin, fitted with an iron lock, though she had died of disease and posed no danger to anyone. Why lock the coffin? What were they afraid she might do even in death? Another story placed Tituba in Rhode Island, working for a Quaker family known for treating enslaved people with unusual kindness. This Tituba supposedly told her story late in life to a young woman in the household, who wrote it down but never shared it publicly. According to the story, the manuscript was destroyed by the woman's family after her death, out of fear that it would reopen old wounds and stir dangerous questions. What was in that manuscript? What version of events did Tituba tell when she finally had a listener who did not threaten her? A third account came from a Boston merchant's diary dated 1695, discovered in the 1920s, and quickly returned to private hands. The merchant wrote of encountering a Caribbean woman on the docks who approached him and addressed him by a name he had not used since his time in Barbados. She smiled at him, he wrote, and said, "The tall man from Boston remembers, I think." Then she vanished into the crowd. The merchant never mentioned her again, but his later diary entries grew anxious, filled with references to old sins and divine judgment. He died in 1698, relatively young, of what was described as a wasting illness. Were any of these stories about the real Tituba? There is no way to know. The historical record remains silent, but the stories themselves are revealing. They suggest a woman who survived, who carried dangerous knowledge, who was never truly free and never truly safe. They suggest that powerful people continue to fear her long after the trials ended. There's another possibility, darker still. What if Tituba never left the Salem jail alive? What if the unknown person who paid her fees and purchased her did so not to employ her, but to silence her permanently? The transaction is recorded. £7 paid. Tituba sold. But there is no record of where she went or who bought her. The name in the ledger is illegible, perhaps intentionally so. In colonial Massachusetts, the death of an enslaved person required little documentation. They were property, not people. If Tituba died shortly after her release, if her new owner disposed of her body in an unmarked grave or consigned it to the sea, there would be no record. She would simply vanish from the written world, which is exactly what happened. This possibility is supported by the complete absence of any trace of her after April 1693. In a society that documented births, deaths, property transfers, church memberships, and court cases obsessively, Tituba leaves nothing behind. For a woman who stood at the center of the most consequential event in Salem's history, that absence is not accidental. It suggests not just obscurity, but deliberate erasure. The Salem Witch Trials are taught in American schools as a cautionary tale about mass hysteria and the danger of false accusations. Students learn about spectral evidence and Puritan religious extremism. They may read Arthur Miller's The Crucible, which recasts Salem as an allegory for McCarthyism. The lesson is always the same. This was a dark chapter, a tragic mistake, something that could never happen again. But the most important part of the story is usually glossed over. Salem was not an accident. It was a weaponization of fear by people with power against those without it. It was a transformation of ordinary grievances into cosmic evil. It was what happens when testimony is valued over evidence, when confession is coerced, when the vulnerable are sacrificed to protect the comfortable. And at the center of it all was an enslaved woman who understood exactly how the system worked, who saw the game being played and chose to play it herself. Tituba's confession was not the hysterical babbling of a broken victim, nor was it simply the sincere belief of a folk practitioner misunderstood by Puritan theology. It was a calculated act of survival. She took the weapon of accusation and turned it, briefly, against those who wielded it. The fact that her testimony was edited, that key documents were hidden, that she herself was made to disappear, all suggest that the authorities understood what she had done. They knew she had been used, and that she had used them in return. They knew the trials had been corrupted from the beginning, and they chose to bury that knowledge along with her. That is the story America never wanted told. Not the story of witches or poison grain or mass delusion, but the story of deliberate manipulation of law and fear by the powerful, enabled by a system that elevated certain voices while erasing others. The story of how easily neighbor can be turned against neighbor when the right mechanisms are put in place. The story of who gets remembered and who gets erased. Tituba's name appears in every account of Salem, yet she herself remains invisible. The woman whose word sent 19 people to their deaths, who outlived her accusers and her judges, and then vanished. We know almost nothing about her, where she was born, how she learned what she knew, what she thought as she sat in that jail cell, listening to the screams of the condemned. What became of her after someone paid for her freedom and her silence? The archives remain closed. The documents remain missing. The descendants of Salem's most prominent families preserve their respectability, and Tituba remains buried in the blank spaces of history. A name without a face, a voice without an echo. But the absence is itself part of the story. The erasure is the point. Some histories are too dangerous to tell. Some truths are too threatening to power to be allowed into the record. Salem could not afford to acknowledge that its witch hunt had been orchestrated, that testimony had been coached and edited, that an enslaved woman had been both victim and strategist. So she was allowed to disappear. And in that disappearance, in that carefully maintained silence, lies the real horror of Salem. Not demons or witches or spectral torment, just people with power protecting themselves. And a woman who briefly threatened that power before being swallowed by the very mechanism she had helped create. The question that haunts Salem is not whether witches were real. It is what happened to Tituba. Where did she go after April of 1693? Did she live out her days in quiet servitude, carrying her secrets to an unmarked grave? Did she die shortly after her release, silenced permanently by those who feared what she knew? Or did she survive, moving from place to place, always looking over her shoulder, always aware that powerful people wanted her gone? We will never know. The historical record is silent, and that silence is deafening. It tells us everything we need to know about who controls history, whose stories are preserved, and whose are buried. More than 300 years later, we are still telling stories about Salem. We have built museums and memorials. We have written books, plays, and films. We have analyzed the trial from every angle: psychological, sociological, legal, religious. Yet we still do not know what became of the woman who started it all. Maybe that is intentional. Maybe some stories are meant to stay buried. Maybe the real lesson of Salem is not about superstition or due process, but about power. Who has it, how they use it, and what they will do to keep it. Tituba understood power. She understood that in a world where she had none, the only weapon available to her was words. So she used them carefully, strategically to survive. And for a brief moment, she held more power than anyone in Salem. The power to name names, to shape the narrative, to decide who will be accused and who might be spared. But that power was temporary, and it was dangerous. The moment she was no longer useful, she became a liability. And liabilities are erased. That is the story America never wanted told. Not because it is about witchcraft or Puritans or colonial Massachusetts, but because it is about now, about how power operates, about who is allowed to speak and who is silenced, about whose stories matter and whose disappear. Tituba's story matters, not because she was innocent. She was not, by any simple measure. Her confession, however strategic, contributed to the deaths of innocent people. But her story matters because it exposes a machinery of oppression, the way systems of power turn the vulnerable against one another, the way truth is buried when it threatens the comfortable. And the fact that we still do not know what happened to her, that her fate remains a mystery after 3 centuries, tells us something else. The machinery is still running. The archives are still closed. The documents are still missing. The powerful are still protecting themselves. Some ghosts do not haunt houses. They haunt history. And Tituba's ghost lingers in every gap in a record, every missing page, every unanswered question about Salem. She exists in the silence, in the things we do not know and may never be allowed to know. Perhaps that is the most terrifying thing about Salem. Not what happened, but what was made to disappear. We are still not allowed to fully understand what really happened. Not the executions themselves, but the erasure. Not the witch hunt, but the cover-up. And at the center of it all, invisible yet unavoidable, stand a woman whose name we know, but whose life we do not. A woman who spoke words that reshaped history, then vanished into the silence that history so often reserves for people like her. Tituba, no family name, no recorded place of birth, no grave, no documented ending. Just a single name in official records and a vast empty space where a human life should be. That emptiness is not an accident. That void is a story. The silence surrounding her fate is not meaningless. It is deliberate, and it is still speaking, if we are willing to listen closely enough. So, what do you think happened to Tituba? Was she deliberately silenced to protect powerful families whose names never appeared in the records? Or was her disappearance simply the tragic and common fate of countless enslaved people whose lives were never considered worth recording. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to uncover more hidden stories from the darkest corners of American history, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. History has a way of burying the truths that matter most.